This is the Spirit and Wellness Show. News and information from a higher perspective. With your host, Harry Wilkinson. Yes, this is your host, Harry Wilkinson, and welcome once again to the Spirit and Wellness Show, or if this is your first time tuning in, welcome. This is the show where we take a look at the days and weeks events, happenings in the world, international news, cultural news, news and on the environment, technology, entertainment, everything that we interact with, hear about through the news media or other sources, and we take a look at it from a higher perspective. We take a look at what it means in our culture, what it means to our evolution, and how we are creating these things as powerful spiritual beings that we are. How we are creating these stories and experiencing them, and what they tell us about ourselves. It's a unique perspective, I think. I don't think there's anybody else really doing this kind of a show on a weekly basis regarding news anyway. I think there's lots of people talking about spirituality and about metaphysics and that sort of thing. But using it as a way to kind of interpret news stories, I haven't heard anybody else do that. So it's a niche that I'm trying to fill here because I find it helpful to remember the truth of who and what we are. And these stories that we think of as, our real world are actually not the real world. Not the truth of who we are anyway. But they are creations of our own. And why do we do such? Well, to have experiences, to, I guess in a way, learn and re-experience and reconnect with ultimately who we truly are and the oneness that we are. And these stories help us do that in an interesting way, if you do not allow them to push your buttons, if you step away from the, good, bad mindset, and you go into these stories, really examine the feelings they bring, go into them, and recognize the truth of them, recognize them as, amazing creations with lots of energy behind them, and take that energy back. It's an amazingly liberating experience. Well, in any case, not to blather on too long about that, we are talking this week about climate change, this having been Earth Day a few days ago, and also there being a summit on the climate this week. We're going to be talking about climate change and energy and how they are evolving in what I call the transition era. The transition era is this era we're living in now, where the seeds have been planted for radical systemic change in so many areas of our lives. Everything from the economy to, as I'm talking about here, energy, to medicine and health, as we talked about last week. But really, underlying it all is a major shift in how we view the world and the interconnectedness with which we view the world. This change in viewpoint, which is highlighted and paralleled in many ways by a change in the scientific viewpoint led by discoveries in quantum physics and the revealing of things like the so-called God particle, and a deeper understanding of what dark matter is, this mysterious matter that is connecting us all but can't be seen. And if all of these things sound like metaphors for spiritual being or, a spiritual force, I think they absolutely are. And so this shift in our awareness, this, evolution in awareness is what is underlying all of the things that are happening in the transition era. So we're going to talk about the climate. We're going to talk about the summit that happened there, and we're going to talk about what the energy transition is. Great article from David Houle, who I've been talking about the past couple of weeks. As a futurist, and has a real good understanding, although he doesn't use the kind of terms I use. And he doesn't really talk about, spirituality per se. He does get the transition that we are going through. He calls it the shift age. And his Evolution Shift blog focuses on a lot of the things that we talk about on this show. So going to share some information and articles that he has written about energy use, which are, his predictions are quite remarkable, by the way. But first, before we get into any of that, wanted to talk today about another event that I think has captured the attention of many people throughout the world, as these things often do when we have tragic deaths of beloved public figures and entertainers, as we had this week with the passing of Prince Rogers Nelson. So, first of all, the passing, quite sudden, quite unexpected for most of us. And, there have been a number of deaths in recent years that have been very similar. I'm recalling the passing of Robin Williams. And even the passing of Joan Rivers, sudden, unexpected passings. And even the passing of Michael Jackson, same kind of thing. Although there were those that saw that sort of coming, I think most of us were not aware of the danger that Michael was in that caused his passing. So, and if you've listened to the show before, when I've talked about these major events that kind of focus a lot of attention from a lot of people, my belief has always been that these events are designed to bring us together, to help remind us of our oneness. And musicians and music are amazing ways in which we do that, in which we recognize a connectedness, recognize a oneness. And, Prince fandom is among the most intense fandom. If you are not familiar with what that's like, it's almost, in many ways, Prince fandom is almost a spiritual experience in itself. I won't say a cult, but there are, many aspects to the kinds of things that Prince sang about, talked about, that involve very evolved beliefs. Some of them might seem a little bit strange. For a while, he talked about things like the Illuminati and things like that. But there was always a very, very spiritual connection that Prince fans had with one another and with Prince himself. And he talked about spirituality in his songs. And how spirituality in his world, was a part of human experiences in the same way that our sexuality was. And in fact, he sort of intertwined those two in many ways. Apparently, from what I understand, he was a Jehovah's Witness as he went on later in his years. I think he became a little bit more committed to that. But he obviously didn't follow a lot of the strict rules that Jehovah's Witnesses have for themselves and their followers. But that's what he aligned with. That was his religious affiliation. So there are, I think, many meanings that we can look at regarding, Prince's passing. As I say on this program, everybody at the metaphysical level, we all, just as we create everything that's going on in our lives, we also create our deaths or our passing away or our moving on from our current physical avatars. And we create them to say something, make a statement or give something to those who have been involved in our world and still remain. So, in many ways, Prince lived mysteriously. I mean, Prince was a walking advertisement for embracing mystery in your life. He thrived on being, eccentric and mysterious, and you could never quite know exactly what was going on with him. And this passing this way is, exactly the way he lived his life and exactly the persona that he provided. So again, the idea of transitioning, and to add to it, there's lots of rumors that he was beginning to, write his memoirs, very recently, and that there seemed to be intimate intimations that he somehow knew or sensed the end was coming. So there's that, and we'll get back to that in a minute. There's this mysterious statement that he made. This was after having been hospitalized. He had been taken off a flight. He was on his way home from a concert and fell ill. His people have said that he had flu-like symptoms. That does not seem to be the case, and I'll get into that in a minute. But in any case, he was rushed to the hospital and then released the next day and made a public appearance at his Paisley Park club there, to assure people that he was fine, and that, and the quote goes, don't waste any, or give it a couple of days before wasting any prayers on me. Very strange thing to say. Yeah, it's a very odd thing to say. Maybe he thought whatever was wrong with him would straighten out in a couple of days, or what have you. But there are, again, rumors that perhaps he had a sense of his impending death, and we'll get into what all that means. But I think to remember from the spiritual perspective or the metaphysical perspective that just like so many of these, what I would call musical avatars, going back to the 60s with Jimi Hendrix and Janis Joplin and Jim Morrison, and later on with John Lennon and Kurt Cobain. Some of them passed by accident, some of them passed by suicide. Oh, and then there's Whitney Houston recently. Of course, that was not so unexpected because of her drug troubles, but what they have in common is that they represent a youthful energy, the kind of power, the kind of energy that we have as young people in our teens and 20s. They focus that, they represent that. And for many of them, it's difficult to imagine. Oh, and I forgot Elvis. Elvis should be involved. Elvis was probably the first. But in any case, these avatars seem to come to make breakthroughs, deliver messages musically. Change how we listen to music, change how we think about music, and also to express or voice ideas of youth. And when they're done, they go. It's hard to imagine a 75-year-old Jimi Hendrix, isn't it? It's hard to imagine a 70-year-old lady named Janis Joplin. It's hard to imagine these things. Now, that's not to say we don't have them. We have, Paul. Paul Simon too, but Paul McCartney from the Beatles. He's in his 70s. Certainly, the Rolling Stones are up there, and they represent a youthful kind of energy. But for some reason, there are certain, people, certain avatars, as I'll call them, that just represent that. And I think Prince is one of them. Certainly, for those of us of a certain generation, those of us in my generation, and he continued to influence generations continually. But if you grew up in your teens and 20s with Prince, he represented something. He represented a lot of the self-discovery, a lot of the questions, a lot of the answers, a lot of the feelings and the fears and the confusions of becoming a young adult and growing into young adulthood. And That's what he represented. So my theory is that a lot of these beings come into the world to deliver these things and leave the world when they're done with them. You know, and if you think about it, certainly Prince's story is a good example of this remarkable man, this remarkable young man, who, you know, by the age of 19 was accomplished enough as a musician to record songs in which he played all the instruments, and also was able to command, a record deal, being completely unknown. I mean, completely unknown. And from one record was able to secure a record deal that would allow him to have full creative control over what he did. I mean, it's remarkable. And so, as I say, I think there's certain people that come here and they're here to do a certain thing, and when it's done, they go. And they go in a way that leaves us maybe scratching our heads, but also leaves us thinking about things and so on. So, okay. So, yes, the flu thing that they reported doesn't seem to have really happened. What really happened, many are saying, is that he was being treated for a drug overdose. He was only, they say, 45 minutes away from his home when they stopped in Moline, Illinois, and rushed him to the hospital. And according to some sources, doctors gave him what they call a save shot, which is often administered to counteract the effects of opiates. It was apparently doctors, according to these sources, and these sources come from the website TMZ, who, they might seem like they're tabloid, but they really do have good sources and good information. Particularly when people don't want to tell the whole story, which is, what's going on here. Apparently, they wanted him to stay in the hospital for 24 hours, but they couldn't arrange for a private room, and so they left. They were concerned about him when he left because they felt he wasn't doing well. So there's indications that there was some sort of health crisis he was going on, and has something to do with pharmaceuticals. There's also reports that he visited hours before he died a pharmacy, and that it had been the fourth time he'd visited it that week, and that he was not in good shape when he showed up at this pharmacy. So what I'm going to predict is that now there's been an autopsy done, and I think what we'll find out is that he had some addiction to opiates or painkillers of some kind. He had some kind of health condition, or he maybe hurt himself, and he was given these drugs and he became addicted to them. And that is something that will then galvanize attention around what is a very serious problem, which is the proliferation of these very, very powerful drugs, and very addictive drugs that, while giving much pain relief, can also be life-threatening. So I think that we'll, in the days to come, be hearing a lot about that. Okay, and I've gone on way too long. I really wanted to dedicate this episode to climate change, so let me get to that. So this climate accord that they had in Paris is seemingly behind the time, because the climate has changed even more during the first 3 months of 2016. They have been the hottest ever recorded Greenland's massive ice sheet has melted more this spring than researchers have ever seen. Warming seas are turning coral reefs into underwater graveyards, and scientists are warning that sea levels could rise far faster than anyone expected by the end of the century, with severe impacts for coastal communities around the globe. We're already seeing coastal communities getting hit. So this United Nations Earth Day agreement that was signed by 150 countries is coming, at the very least, right on time. This agreement, in case you've forgotten, was created last year in Paris amidst lots of rancor. But 4 months after that agreement, even more reminders about shifts in Earth's climate, requiring very ambitious actions, and that even the agreements that they've agreed to may not be enough. We've seen the strongest hurricanes, the warmest start to a year that we've ever seen here in 2016, after the warmest year on record in 2015. So these developments are showing us very clearly we're at a tipping point, if you will. What they're trying to do is keep global temperatures below 2 degrees Celsius, from rising below, less than 2 degrees. And what they're saying is that even with the participants' current pledges of reducing carbon emissions and so forth, that 2 degree threshold will be, blown past, and that will trigger more drastic changes in the climate. With just the pledges they have right now, there is apparently little hope of hitting the more ambitious target of 1.5 degrees Celsius. So, it's not enough. But it's an important step. And considering the denial that many people have been in about what's going on, it is a really important step. And there's a lot of information here about the climate change. We'll get back to that. But I want to also talk about energy, because energy and its use and the type of energy that is used goes hand in hand with this climate change. So I want to go to David Houle and this article that he wrote in March last month about what he sees as a major energy transition that has begun. So he says that we're at the very beginning of the end of the fossil fuel era, and the use of fossil fuels will continue for decades. But the years 2015 to 2017 will be looked back upon as the beginning of the transition from growth to long, slow decline. And he predicts this will cause tremendous disruption, market volatility, geopolitical upheavals, entire industries will collapse, and profound changes in society will happen. He calls it one of the most massive instances of creative destruction in history. Since fossil fuels have powered human endeavors for 200 years, no one alive has experienced what is about to happen. This transition is going to be very hard for most people to understand, and economists and pundits will not be able to, forecast what is occurring. and they may only gain general understanding after it's happened. All of which goes hand in hand with what I'm calling the transition era. So signs are everywhere that this has already begun, and he cites the collapse of the price of oil, and that's something that he apparently forecast 2 years ago. And there's no increase in demand that is very significant. The supply is outstripping demand. There's excess oil. Well, the last time he says that anything like this occurred was the first 2 years of the Great Recession. Then it was simply a rapid global economic contraction that caused demand to plummet. The oil exporting countries cut supply, and in a couple of years the price went back up. In the 8 years since then, a number of trends have dramatically changed the landscape. First, the cost of renewable and alternative energy has dropped dramatically. So now it costs the same price to use for electricity as fossil fuels. And energy efficiency has increased everywhere thanks to technology. So the cars we're driving are more efficient. People are using things like Uber and Lyft, which drive down the demand for oil. And climate change, which is caused by fossil fuels, is now fully in the global consciousness, as he says. And people are moving away from it. And finally, he says the Middle East has been totally disrupted, and OPEC has completely lost its coordinated ability to dictate levels of output and pricing. So oil exporting countries are continuing to pump at high levels. And he cites 4 countries: Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, and Kuwait. And those are the only countries that can make a profit with oil at $30 a barrel. So the longer the barrel prices stay in the $30 to $40 range, competitors in those countries will be selling at a loss. And that includes countries like Russia, Canada, Venezuela, and the fracking industry here in the U.S. So these are causing economic meltdowns across the world. And Nigeria and Venezuela are ones suffering already, and Russian economy is starting to. And U.S. fracking is going to continue to kind of fail. So there'll be a lot of economic loss, as he says. A lot of debt, along with declining economic growth in China, and that will cause the global economy to drag, and that will cut the need for fossil fuels even more. So now he's predicting that by 2020, it will become very clear that the fossil fuel era is over. And large energy companies will have a completely new reality to face. They won't be seen as good investments. They'll have to scale financial resources down and move into new forms of energy that they have not really embraced. We know that the fossil fuels cause climate change and are the single greatest cause of poor health and death for humanity and thousands of other species. More people die from air pollution than all the cancers combined. Did you know that? I didn't. From all the cancers combined, more people die from air pollution than all cancers combined. It's estimated that a person dies from a health problem related to air pollution every 4 seconds. So now alternative and renewable energies are representing a great wealth opportunity that will, kind of evolve over the next 2 to 3 decades.
there will be all kinds of things, not only just kinds of businesses, but also, charging stations, batteries, storage technologies, clearing carbon from the atmosphere. These will be massive wealth and employment opportunities. So, he's saying that by 2050, fossil fuels will still be used, but they will be about the same percentage of energy that alternative and renewable energy is used in now. So, that's the trajectory that he sees. It's very fascinating. And these are all predictions that, I would find very difficult, if not impossible, to, argue with. They make sense. And I think if you think about it, you'll see it makes sense too. So we're here. It's happening in the transition era. We are transitioning away from fossil fuels, and it's going to be disruptive, as everything in this transition era, as I've kept stating, is going to be. These are transitions that are, 2 steps forward, 1 step back at best in most situations, because they are such big transitions and so deeply ingrained in how we've been doing things, that the disruption will be, quite palpable in many arenas. Now, for others who've been waiting for these kinds of changes, it won't feel like that. It will feel like a new day. But for those who are, in one way or another invested in the old way of doing things, yeah, it could hurt a bit. It really could hurt a bit. And even those of us who are, anxious for change, we might not see that change happen as rapidly as we want. So, the transition era is here. So, I will leave you with that until we speak again.